So how many of you know what epiphany means? You don't have to raise your hand. An epiphany is a sudden discovery. For example, Isaac Newton's realization that a falling apple and the orbiting moon are both pulled by the same force, that being gravity, is an example of epiphany. Now, in case you think that you're going to get an epiphany in algebra or some other course that's going to get you through, you probably won't, because epiphanies come after a lot of thought about something. You've been thinking, and suddenly it hits you. That's an epiphany. Suddenly the light shines in. Church tradition has it that on the ecclesiastical calendar, that Epiphany is the season immediately following Christmas and lasting until Ash Wednesday. That's the day after Mardi Gras, which is not on the ecclesiastical calendar, by the way, but is a holiday in the state where I come from. Epiphany commemorates the visit of the wise men to see Jesus, which was the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles. That's you and me. The breaking of light of God into a very dark and troubled world. Epiphany is about some people who went searching. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, but every semester I still look out and I wonder why you're here. Now, I don't mean in chapel, because you're required to come to chapel, so I know why you're here. Not really out of that much out of touch, but even if you have to be here, I hope you come with some expectation, however low it may be. I often sit in the balcony for chapel. I know what seekers and searchers are like. They usually hang back. They usually kind of sit in the back because, they're just not ready to buy into all this Jesus stuff and all that. So let's kind of see what's going on. That's okay. That's okay. I'm glad we have searchers and seekers. And I'm glad that your journey brought you this way this morning. The world would be a duller place if we didn't have searchers and seekers. Epiphany is the season for searchers. It's a reminder that God's light demands to shine in the darkness. Now, last year was cloaked in both darkness and light. We had Ebola, we had ISIS, we had Ferguson. By the time Christmas came, we were ready for the lights of Christmas. At times, maybe you've felt like the psalmist who wrote in the unlucky psalm, that's Psalm 13, by the way, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall." Do you ever wonder where God is in all the stuff of life? Do you wonder why he seems to be silent when other people are suffering? Well, I'm going to tell you a little story. It's a true story of someone who had an epiphany that saved his life. How many of you recognize the name Louis Zamperini? Okay, a few of you. You went to see the movie Unbroken, right? Probably. How many of you read the book by Laura Hildebrand? A few of you. An excellent book and an excellent movie. Louis was the son of Italian immigrants who settled in Torrance, California in 1919. Because he spoke no English, Louis was often targeted by bullies until his father taught him to box. After that, he said, "I was so good at it that I started relishing the idea of getting even. I was kind of addicted to it." He was a troublemaker, a thief, a delinquent, and he was failing in school. Most of the stories of his childhood ended with the words, "And then I ran like mad." When he was in his early teens, a kid from his neighborhood was deemed feeble-minded. He was institutionalized, and he was barely saved from sterilization from eugenicists who were bent on culling the unfit from the genetic pool. Not one of the finest chapters in our history, by the way. Thinking he might be targeted, Louis started trying to change his life, and salvation came in the form of running. His brother, who was already a high school track star, forced him to come along on training runs. Louis got hooked on running. He discovered he was very good at it, and not only broke all his brother's records, but set the world interscholastic record for the mile in a time of 4 minutes, 21.2 seconds. It was widely thought that Louis would be the first person to break the 4-minute mile barrier. In 1936, Louis decided to try out for the Olympics, but his best distance was the mile, or the 1,500 meters, which is the metric mile. But there were too many people in that field. He didn't think he had a chance at making it, so he decided to run the 5,000 meters. Now, he had never run the 5,000 meters in competition. On minimal training and on one of the hottest days of the year in Manhattan, Louis sprinted to a dead heat tie with the American record holder, and he became the youngest ever American qualifier in the 5,000 meters, a record that stands today. On the boat over to Berlin, to the Olympics, he and many other of the Depression-era athletes, most of whom had never been in a real restaurant, gorged themselves on free food, and most of them gained a lot of weight. In fact, some of the wrestlers were not able to wrestle because they gained too much weight. Louis gained 12 pounds. Feeling fat and leaden-legged and outgunned by the favored Finns, he slogged through the first laps of the race. However, on the bell lap, he thought of something his brother had told him. A lifetime of glory is worth a moment of pain. And he thought, let it go. He started accelerating dramatically, kicking, pushing himself. The crowd caught sight of his rally and began shouting him on. He is number 751 right there. Even Adolf Hitler was watching from his box and would later ask to meet the boy with the fast finish. Louis didn't win, but his time was 12 seconds faster than the fastest American in all of 1936. In the 3 fastest miles ever run to that point, the winner's final lap had been clocked at 61.2 seconds, 58.9, and 59.1. In the 5,000 meters, which is 3.1 miles, turning a final lap in less than 70 seconds was rare. The world record holder in the 5,000 meter that year spun his last lap in 69.2 seconds. Louis had run his last lap in 56 seconds. Incredible. In 1938, running for the University of Southern California, Louis set a national collegiate record in the mile of 4 minutes, 8 seconds, despite severe cuts on his shins from competitors attempting to spike him in the race. He was primed for the 1940 Olympics in Tokyo, Japan, to be his shining moment. Now, you might think that at this point, all of Louis' life would be full of light. But then the dark shadows came. Weeks after Louis' victory in Japan withdrew as host of the Olympics, and the games were transferred to Helsinki, Finland. Louis rolled on, scorching a mile at Madison Square Garden in 4:07.9, with the Olympics now just months away. On what would be a dark day in April of 1940, Louis returned to the Southern California campus to learn that Hitler had unleashed his blitzkrieg across Europe. Helsinki's Olympic Stadium had been collapsed by Soviet bombs. Gunnar Hockert, who had beaten Louis and won gold for Finland in the Berlin Olympics, was dead, killed defending his country, and the Olympics had been canceled. Louis was unmoored. He was drifting from one thing to another as America slid toward war. In 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Louis enlisted in the Army Air Corps, and he began training as a bombardier. On August the 19th of 1942, Louis stood with his family for this picture, and then he headed off to war. That's Louis, and that's his brother. Louis was assigned to a 9-man bombing crew. They were hoping to get a B-17 Flying Fortress, a handsome, masculine, nimble, fiercely armed, and practically indestructible plane. Instead, they got the plane no one wanted, a new bomber called the B-24 Liberator. The men nicknamed it the Flying Coffin. One pilot said it was like sitting on the front porch and flying the house. The men nicknamed Louis' plane Superman. Here's a picture of a B-24 taking flak. And here's a picture of a B-24 right after it was struck by flak. The radio operator was the only one to survive because he was thrown from the plane and he managed to open his parachute. The odds, by the way, of survival of a crew flying 30 missions were 50%. So your odds were 1 in 2 that you were going to die if you were flying in a bomber. But things went pretty well for his crew early on, even as other people around them lost their lives. In April of 1943, his bomber was badly damaged on a bombing mission. 1 crewman was killed, 2 others badly wounded, and the plane damaged beyond repair. Only the skill of the pilot and luck enabled them to make it back to land. The crew counted 594 holes in the bomber. Here is a Louis surveying some of the damage. While awaiting reassignment in Hawaii, the crew was asked to go on a search mission for another lost bomber. On the morning they left, Louis ran a 4-minute, 12-second mile in sand on the beach at Oahu. He was probably in the best shape of his life, which would serve him well in the days ahead. The crew was given a bomber named the Green Hornet. No one wanted to fly this plane because of its notoriety as a lemon. It had been cannibalized for parts, including some of the survival provisions. And when it flew with the tail down, kind of like this. Nobody wanted to be in that plane. On the search, sure enough, the 2 left engines of the plane went out. They could not be restarted, and it sent the bomber into the ocean 850 miles from land. 8 crewmen died in the crash. Louis, Phil, the pilot, both were seriously injured, and Mac, another crewman, survived the crash. 2 life rafts deployed, in which there were 3 tins of water and a few chocolates. The uninjured crewman, Mac, panicked at their predicament, and that night he sneaked the chocolates and ate them all. The longest any person had survived to that point on a raft was 24 days. And you can see there's not much room in one of those rafts. The ones who survived 24 days, several went mad before they were rescued. For 47 days, Louis and Phil survived on captured rainwater, small fish eaten raw, and 2 albatrosses that they managed to catch. They were continually attacked by sharks, survived a typhoon, and were strafed 8 times by a Japanese bomber, which punctured the rafts, sinking one of them, but miraculously hit no one. At one point, only a day or two from dying of thirst, Louis prayed to God that if you will save me, I will serve you forever. Remember that. The next day, it rained. Mac died on the 33rd day. In her book, Unbroken, Laura Hildebrand muses about why Louis and Phil survived where the third uninjured crewman did not. Well, maybe it was biological. Maybe some people are wired more for optimism and others for doubt. Phil was a deeply religious person, though Louis was practically unaware of that. But he sang hymns and he prayed silently, and he carried with him a faith that was instilled in him by his parents. Louis, always defiant, saw it as a challenge to his wits. So perhaps Louis and Phil's hope displaced their fear. The other crewman's hopelessness caused him to fade the fastest. But the worst was yet to come, believe it or not. After surviving 47 days in a raft and crossing 2,000 miles of ocean, they were captured by the Japanese Navy just as they neared land. The first prison they were taken to was on Kwajalein Atoll, known to the Americans as Execution Island. By this time, Louis weighed 70 or 80 pounds. Both of them lost about half of their body weight on the raft. Beaten, starved, and brutally interrogated, Louis learned later he was only kept alive because one of the guards recognized that he had been in the Olympics and thought that he might have some value to the Japanese. The second camp he was sent to was one for POWs who were not registered as prisoners of war, and as such, they were thought to be dead and were not allowed any contact with the Red Cross or even an opportunity to send a letter to their family and tell them they were alive. No one even knew they were being held at this camp. They were at the mercy of the cruel guards. After a year and a day, Louis was declared dead by the War Department. The years as POW were filled with daily beatings, starvation, disease, and all kinds of inhumane treatment. For example, on one occasion, Louis was made to stand while every one of the prisoners in the camp hit him in the face. If a POW did not strike him hard enough, the guard would beat that POW and make him hit Louis again. Louis was hit in the face 220 times. One prison guard, nicknamed the Bird by the POWs, singled out Louis for torment. He was later 7th on the list of the 40 most wanted war criminals in Japan. I can't begin to describe the torturous treatment that Louis and the others received in these camps, but I would encourage you to read the book Unbroken for yourself. There were times when Louis thought he could go no further, when he felt he'd been forgotten, when his physical and emotional will were at rock bottom. And during those times, he was kept going by glimmers of news, such as rumors of American victories, or a kindness from another prisoner in the form of a teaspoon of stolen sugar, or even the most passive type of rebellion that enabled him to keep some dignity. For example, during his beatings by the Bird, Louis would clench his fist as an inward sign of rebellion. Now, the movie ends with the liberation of American POWs. This is the kind of condition they were in when they were liberated. These are actual pictures of POWs from a Japanese prison camp. They were liberated following the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Louis eventually returned home to a hero's welcome. He was 28 years old. There was a lot of life to be lived, and the most important part of his story was yet to come. Though outwardly Louis appeared to be the same old Louis, he was inwardly suffering bouts of anxiety. Everyone wanted to hear his story, and the War Department booked him on a speaking tour. Standing before crowds became a gut-wrenching experience for him. Every night he would see the bird in his dreams, often waking up in cold sweats. One of the things Louis feared most was when the bird would take his belt off and he would strike Louis repeatedly in the face with its buckle. And this became a recurring part of his dreams. In 1946, Louis met a girl from Miami on one of his speaking tours, and he married her the same year. He tried to straighten up, but instead he fell further into drinking, smoking, fighting, suffering from what we would call PTSD today. He made no effort to find a real job, instead getting by on his celebrity. He tried training again for the Olympics, but he was forced to stop when an ankle injury he suffered at the hands of a POW camp guard flared up and ended his competitive running. He drank to forget the war, but when he would pass out, the dreams would return. One night in a dream, he struggled with the bird, raising his hands to his throat, trying to crush the life out of him. When he suddenly awakened, he was strangling his pregnant wife. His rages began to consume him. He became obsessed with the thought of traveling to Japan and hunting down and killing Mitsuhiro Watanabe, alias the Bird. He jumped headlong into scheme after scheme to raise the money to get back to Japan and murder the Bird in the confrontation that he thought would save him. His marriage was falling apart. He developed the idea that God was toying with him. When he heard preaching on the radio, he angrily turned it off, and he forbade his wife Cynthia from attending church. In September of 1949, a young Billy Graham came to Los Angeles to lead the evangelical crusade that would eventually make his name a household name. On a vacant lot, he set up a circus tent and 6,500 chairs, poured down acres of sawdust, and he started preaching to a half-empty tent. But attendance began to grow. When newspaper magnate William Hearst famously issued the two-word order to his editors to puff Graham, attendance exploded to over 10,000 every night. Now, Cynthia, Louis's wife, wanted to attend, but Louis refused, so she went alone. After the first night, she came home and told Louis she wasn't going to divorce him. But when she told Louis that the reason was that she had experienced a religious awakening, Louis was appalled. Cynthia and her neighbors kept badgering Louis to attend the crusade, and he reluctantly agreed to go, but just for one night. Graham's sermon that night was titled "The Only Sermon Jesus Ever Wrote," from John 8. It's the story of the woman taken in adultery when Jesus writes in the sand. Graham looked about and he said, "Here tonight there's a drowning man, a drowning woman that is lost out in the sea of life." Well, Louis felt indignant rage welling up inside him, and as soon as the invitation started, Louis grabbed Cynthia's arm and bulled his way out of the tent. The next day was Sunday, and Cynthia pestered Louis all day to see Graham again, finally wearing him down, but only with the understanding that they would leave as soon as the invitation began. That night, Graham spoke of how the world was in an age of war, an age defined by persecution and suffering. Why, Graham asked, is God silent while good men suffer? He described a God who is interested in every person, who works miracles, who gives grace to go forward through suffering. Louis was winding tight. He remembered how he miraculously was thrown free from the wires that had entrapped him when the Green Hornet sank, how the raft had been repeatedly strafed and yet no bullets had struck them, how he had fallen into unbearably cruel whirls and yet had borne them. The invitation began, and Graham said, "Nobody leaving. You can leave while I'm preaching, but not now." Louis pushed through the crowd anyway, but when he got to the aisle, a memory came upon him. He was on the raft. Phil lay crumpled before him. There was Mac's breathing skeleton, endless ocean around him, sharks circling. He was dying of thirst. And through his swollen lips he whispered a promise. If you will save me, I will save you forever. And then, just as had happened on the raft, he felt rain falling, though it wasn't raining. It was the last flashback that he would ever have. Louis went to the front, and he accepted Christ. That night, he went home. He poured his cache of liquor down the drain. He threw away his cigarettes. And for the first time in 5 years, that night, the bird did not come into his dreams. And he would never come again. In a single, silent moment, his rage, his fear, his humiliation, and his helplessness had fallen away. He was a new creation. The rest of that Psalm 13 is, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me." The next year, Louis visited many of the guards from his POW days to let them know that he had forgiven them, including a visit to Sugamo prison, where many Japanese war criminals were imprisoned. He embraced those who recognized him, and he expressed his forgiveness. In 1998, at age 81, he ran a leg in the Olympic torch relay for the Winter Olympics in Japan, not far from the POW camp where he had been held. Louis died last July at the age of 97. Louis Zamperini's life was filled with darkness and light. But even during the darkest days, the light of grace shined deep within him. I don't know what twistings and turnings have brought you here today. Very few people have a story as dramatic as Louis'. But Epiphany brings us all a reminder that the light of God demands to shine in the darkness, just as it did to the wise men, just as it did in Louis' life, and just as it will in yours. Go in grace and peace. Thank you.